I was exhausted beyond words. The kind of bone-deep fatigue that makes your limbs feel like they're filled with wet sand, your eyelids like they're weighted with coins. 3 connecting flights in 2 days will do that to you. The fluorescent airport lights had left an imprint behind my eyes, and the recycled air had dried my skin to a papery texture that no amount of overpriced airport water could fix. The boarding call for my final flight home was a relief. First aboard, at least. The one small luxury I'd allowed myself after receiving my first real paycheck from the art gallery, where I'd finally landed a job after months of rejection. 1 first-class ticket, just this once. Final boarding call for Flight 1422 to Boston, the gate attendant called, her voice carrying the practiced neutrality of someone who had repeated the same phrases thousands of times. I clutched my ticket, adjusted my worn messenger bag, and approached the gate. The attendant's eyes flickered over my casual attire, jeans with a small paint stain on the thigh, a wrinkled blouse I'd hastily changed into in an airport bathroom, and scuffed boots that had seen better days. Her smile tightened almost imperceptibly, but she scanned my ticket without comment. "Enjoy your flight, Miss Carter." The jetway stretched before me like a portal to salvation. Just a few more hours and I'd be home, able to collapse into my own bed in my tiny apartment. The thought was almost enough to bring tears to my eyes. As I stepped onto the plane, the flight attendant's greeting was warm. "Welcome aboard. 3A is on your left, just past the galley." The first-class cabin was a different world. The lighting was softer, the air somehow fresher. Only 6 rows, 2 seats on each side of the aisle. Most were already occupied by men in expensive suits, or women with perfect blowouts and designer luggage. I felt painfully out of place as I searched for my seat, 3A. Window seat. I found it, and almost sobbed with relief when I saw it was empty. I stowed my bag in the overhead compartment, my arms protesting the motion, and practically fell into the wide leather seat. It enveloped me like a cloud, and I closed my eyes, allowing myself to sink into its embrace. The sounds of boarding continued around me. The rustle of coats, the quiet murmurs of conversation, the occasional laugh. I kept my eyes closed, trying to disappear into the seat, to become invisible. Just a few more minutes and I could sleep. A subtle shift in the air around me made my eyes flutter open. A scent cut through the bland airplane smell. Expensive cologne with notes of cedar and something darker, earthier. The type of scent that didn't come from a department store display. "Excuse me," a voice said, low and close to my ear. "I believe you're in my seat." I turned, ready to explain that there must be some mistake, but the words died in my throat. Standing in the aisle was a man who seemed to absorb all the light and attention in the cabin without trying. Tall, broad-shouldered, in a suit that probably cost more than 3 months of my rent. The fabric draped perfectly over his frame, clearly custom-tailored. Dark hair swept back from a face that was all angles and shadows. High cheekbones, a strong jaw dusted with the perfect amount of stubble, and eyes so dark they appeared almost black in the cabin lighting. His presence radiated authority, but it was more than that. There was something dangerous about the way he held himself, something coiled and controlled beneath the veneer of sophistication. Behind him, slightly offset to his right, stood another man, shorter, wider, with watchful eyes that never seemed to stop moving, scanning the cabin in a continuous sweep. I fumbled for my ticket in my bag, my fingers suddenly clumsy. "I'm sorry, I have 3A. I pulled out the crumpled boarding pass and held it up, trying to keep my hand from trembling. The man didn't look at it. Instead, his gaze remained fixed on me, assessing, calculating. Then, to my surprise, his lips curved into a smile that never quite reached his eyes. He leaned closer, close enough that I caught another wave of that intoxicating scent. Close enough that I could see flecks of amber in his dark irises. "Don't move, darling," he murmured, his voice a caress that sent an involuntary shiver down my spine. "Stay exactly where you are." Before I could respond, he straightened and addressed the man behind him. "Marco, help the gentleman in 3B find another seat." The broader man, Marco, nodded once and moved away without question. The dark-eyed man slid into the aisle seat beside me with fluid grace, his shoulder brushing against mine in a way that felt deliberate. But I started, confusion making my thoughts fuzzy. This isn't right. If this is your seat, I should move. I insist, he said, his tone light but brooking no argument. He extended a hand toward me, and I noticed the heavy gold signet ring on his pinky finger, Luca Moretti. I hesitated before taking his hand. His skin was warm, his grip firm but not crushing. Emma Carter. Emma. He said my name like he was tasting it. A pleasure. Marco returned, giving a small nod to Luca. It's taken care of. Luca didn't acknowledge the information. His attention still focused entirely on me. First time in first class, Emma? The question made my cheeks heat with embarrassment. Was it that obvious? Is it that obvious? His smile widened fractionally. You look at everything with appreciation. The regulars take it all for granted. A flight attendant appeared at his side, leaning down slightly. Mr. Moretti, can I get you anything before takeoff? Scotch, neat, and whatever the lady desires. The attendant turned to me with a professional smile. And for you, miss. Just water, please, I said, my throat suddenly dry. When she left, Luca turned those intense eyes back to me. Where are you returning from, Emma Carter? Something about the way he said my full name made it sound like he was memorizing it. San Francisco. I was there for work. I didn't know why I was sharing even that small detail with him. And what kind of work takes you to San Francisco? I shifted in my seat, uncomfortable with his interest, but unable to be rude. I work for an art gallery in Boston. I was meeting with a new artist we're featuring next month. Something flickered in his eyes, interest perhaps. Art. How fascinating. What kind? Contemporary, mostly. The artist I met with works with reclaimed materials, creating beauty from what others have discarded. I stopped myself, feeling foolish for rambling. Beauty from discarded things. He repeated thoughtfully. There's wisdom in that. The flight attendant returned with our drinks. Luca took his without looking at her, his eyes never leaving my face. I clutched my water bottle, wishing it were something stronger. The plane began to push back from the gate, and the safety demonstration started. I turned to watch, grateful for the distraction, but I could feel Luca's gaze on me, intense and unrelenting. You're not watching, I said without turning. I've heard it many times before, he replied, his voice closer to my ear than I expected. And there are more interesting things to observe. The plane taxied to the runway, the engines rumbling beneath us. I gripped the armrests as we accelerated, my body pressing back into the seat. Flying had always made me nervous, especially takeoffs and landings. A warm hand covered mine on the armrest. I looked down in surprise to see Luca's fingers over mine, the gold of his ring glinting in the light. Fear of flying? He asked. I nodded, too startled by the casual touch to speak. Focus on something else, he suggested, his thumb moving in a small, soothing circle over my knuckles. Tell me about your favorite artist. The question was so unexpected that it actually worked, pulling my mind away from the terrifying physics of getting a metal tube airborne. Caravaggio, I said without thinking. His use of light and shadow, the way he captured raw human emotion. I continued talking about Caravaggio's dramatic lighting and controversial life as the plane climbed into the sky, only realizing as we leveled off that Luca's hand was still covering mine, and that I'd been babbling about art history to a complete stranger who probably couldn't care less. I pulled my hand away, embarrassed. Sorry, I get carried away sometimes. Don't apologize, he said. Passion is rare. Most people sleepwalk through life, never caring deeply about anything. There was something hypnotic about his voice, about the intensity of his focus. It made me feel simultaneously exposed and seen in a way that was both uncomfortable and thrilling. The flight attendant appeared again. We'll be serving dinner shortly, Mr. Moretti. Would you and your companion care to see the wine list? Luca accepted the menu with a nod, scanning it briefly before ordering a bottle of red wine I'd never heard of. When the attendant left, I turned to him. I'm not your companion, I said quietly, and I don't think I should drink. I'm tired enough already. His lips curved. Of course you're not. And one glass won't hurt. It will help you relax. The way he said it made it sound reasonable, almost like a prescription from a doctor rather than a suggestion from a stranger. The dinner service began, and despite my protests, Luca insisted on pouring me a glass of the wine, which was rich and complex, and probably cost more than I made in a day. The food was better than any airline meal I'd ever had, though I could barely taste it with Luca sitting so close, his presence dominating my awareness. "So, Emma Carter from Boston," he said as we finished eating. "Tell me about your life." "There's not much to tell," I replied, uncomfortable with his persistent interest. "I work at the gallery. I have a small apartment in Cambridge, and a cat named Vincent." "After Van Gogh?" I nodded, surprised he'd made the connection. "And family?" "My parents are in Connecticut. Dad's a high school English teacher. Mom works in a library. I have a younger brother in college." I stopped, realizing I was sharing personal details with a complete stranger. "What about you?" "What do you do, Mr. Moretti?" Something dark and amused flickered across his face. "Luca, please, I'm in imports and exports. Various business interests." The vagueness of his answer was striking, especially compared to the specific questions he'd asked me. Before I could ponder it further, turbulence hit, causing the plane to drop suddenly. I gasped, my hand automatically reaching out and grabbing his arm. Instead of pulling away, he placed his hand over mine again, his touch steady and warm. "It's just air pockets, Emma. Nothing to fear." The way he said my name made it sound intimate, as if he'd known me for years rather than hours. I withdrew my hand as soon as the turbulence passed, wrapping my arms around myself. "You should try to sleep," he suggested, pressing a button that made his seat recline into an almost flat position. "We still have 4 hours before Boston." The idea was tempting. My eyelids were heavy, and the wine had created a pleasant warmth in my veins. I reclined my own seat and turned toward the window, watching the darkness outside, stars visible above the clouds. I must have dozed off because when I next opened my eyes, the cabin was dimmed, and most passengers appeared to be sleeping. I shifted, disoriented, and found myself leaning against something warm and solid. With a jolt, I realized I had slumped against Luca's shoulder in my sleep. I straightened quickly, mortified. "I'm sorry," I whispered. In the dim light, his expression was unreadable, but I thought I detected amusement. I didn't mind. "How long was I asleep?" "About 2 hours. You talk in your sleep, did you know?" Horror flooded through me. "What did I say?" His lips quirked. "Nothing coherent. Just murmurs." He paused. "You seemed distressed at one point." "Bad dreams," I admitted. "I get them when I'm overtired." He studied me for a moment. "What troubles you, Emma Carter?" The question was too personal, too perceptive. "Nothing. Just stress from work, probably." He didn't believe me. I could tell from the way his eyes narrowed slightly, but he didn't press. "We'll be landing in about an hour and a half," he said instead. "You should drink some water." As if summoned by his words, a flight attendant appeared with a bottle of water, placing it on my tray table with a deferential nod toward Luca. I thanked her, increasingly curious about who this man was that the entire flight crew seemed to know him by name and anticipate his needs. I took a sip of water, trying to clear the fog of sleep from my brain. "Do you fly this route often?" "I divide my time between several cities. Boston is important to my business interests." Again, that vague reference to his work. I wanted to ask more, but sensed it would be unwelcome. Instead, I said, "Thank you for letting me keep the seat. I'm sure yours was perfectly fine, too." His smile was enigmatic. I had my reasons. The plane began its descent into Boston, the change in pressure making my ears pop. Outside the window, the city lights appeared, scattered like fallen stars against the darkness. I'd always loved this view, the moment when a place transitions from abstract concept back to concrete reality. "Beautiful, isn't it?" Luca's voice was close to my ear again. I nodded, not turning from the window. "I always think it looks like constellations." "Most people see chaos," he mused. "You see patterns and beauty." Something about his observation made me turn to look at him. In the dim cabin, with the glow from the window illuminating half his face, he looked almost predatory, sharp features cast in shadow and light, like a Caravaggio painting come to life. "I should get my things ready," I said, suddenly needing distance from his intensity. He made no move to stand, effectively trapping me in my window seat. There's time. The plane continued its descent, the city growing closer, more defined. When we touched down with a jolt, I let out a breath I hadn't realized I'd been holding. Luca's hand briefly covered mine again, a fleeting pressure that was gone before I could react. As the plane taxied to the gate, passengers began stirring, gathering belongings, turning on phones. Luca remained perfectly still beside me, unhurried, as if the world operated on his schedule, rather than the other way around. "Do you have someone meeting you?" he asked, as the seatbelt sign dinged off. "No, I'll take a cab." The thought of navigating the airport, finding transportation, and finally reaching my apartment suddenly seemed exhausting. Luca watched me, his dark eyes missing nothing. "You're tired." It wasn't a question, but I nodded anyway. "I have a car waiting," he said, his tone casual, but brooking no argument. "I'll take you home." Alarm bells rang faintly in my head. "That's not necessary. I don't want to inconvenience you." "It's not an inconvenience. It's on my way." "You don't even know where I live." His smile was slow and knowing. "Cambridge, you said." "Near the gallery, I assume." The fact that he remembered that small detail was both flattering and unsettling. Still, the thought of a comfortable car instead of waiting in line for a cab was tempting. Before I could respond, Marco appeared in the aisle beside our row, standing with quiet vigilance. He hadn't been seated near us during the flight, and I wondered where he'd been. "Everything is ready, sir," Marco said, his eyes scanning the cabin in that same continuous sweep. Luca nodded and finally stood, buttoning his suit jacket with an elegant flick of his wrist. He stepped into the aisle but turned back to offer me his hand. "Shall we?" I hesitated only a moment before taking it, allowing him to help me up. His grip was warm and strong, steadying me as I swayed slightly from exhaustion. The flight attendants all bid goodbye to Luca by name as we exited, their smiles a touch more genuine than their professional masks. Marco walked ahead of us, creating a path through the jetway with his broad shoulders and watchful presence. "Why does everyone know you?" I asked as we entered the terminal. Luca's hand settled lightly on the small of my back, guiding me through the sparse midnight crowd. "I told you. I fly frequently." "It's more than that," I pressed, curiosity temporarily overriding my caution. His only response was a slight curve of his lips, neither confirming nor denying. Marco led us past the main terminal exits toward a side door marked Private Aviation. He held it open, and Luca guided me through with that same light pressure on my back. Outside, the crisp autumn air was a shock after hours in the climate-controlled cabin. A sleek black SUV with tinted windows waited just steps from the door. Another broad-shouldered man in a dark suit stood beside it, opening the rear door as we approached. Marco took up position on the opposite side of the vehicle, his eyes continuously scanning our surroundings. The normalcy of the situation, accepting a ride from a stranger, was rapidly dissolving. This was not someone who simply flew frequently. This was someone with private access, security personnel, and a car waiting at the exact exit point. I stopped. "I think I should just take a cab after all." Luca turned to me, his expression unreadable in the dim light of the private aviation parking area. "Are you afraid of me, Emma?" The question hung between us, loaded with something I couldn't quite name. "I don't know you," I said simply. "Yet you slept on my shoulder for 2 hours." His voice held a trace of amusement. "I assure you, if I intended you harm, I've had ample opportunity." It was a strange reassurance, one that highlighted the power imbalance rather than diminished it. "It's very late," he continued, his tone gentling. "The cab line will be long with multiple flights arriving. You're exhausted. Let me take you home safely. Then, if you wish never to see me again, that will be your choice." The way he phrased it, "if you wish never to see me again," implied he was already considering a future interaction. The thought should have alarmed me more than it did. "All right," I conceded, too tired to argue further. "Thank you." His smile was brief but genuine as he guided me to the waiting car. The interior was luxurious, butter-soft leather seats, subtle lighting, and that same cedar and spice scent that I now associated with Luca. Marco got into the front passenger seat while the other man took the driver's position. Luca settled beside me in the back, close enough that I could feel the heat radiating from his body. but not so close as to touch. "Where in Cambridge?" he asked, as the car pulled away from the terminal. I gave my address, a small apartment on a side street near Central Square, suddenly self-conscious about my modest living situation. The contrast between this man's obvious wealth and my struggling artist's lifestyle couldn't have been more stark. The car moved smoothly through the late-night traffic, the drive from Logan Airport to Cambridge taking less than 20 minutes at this hour. I stared out the window, watching familiar landmarks appear. The bridge over the Charles River, the distinctive silhouette of MIT, the eclectic shops of Mass Ave now darkened for the night. "You're quiet," Luca observed, breaking the silence. "Just tired," I replied, though it was only partly true. My mind was racing, trying to make sense of this strange encounter, of this man who had appeared in my life with the sudden force of a summer storm. "Tell me about your gallery," he said, seeming genuinely interested. "What drew you to art?" The question was innocent enough, and talking about art was familiar territory. I found myself relaxing slightly as I explained my lifelong passion for visual storytelling, my art history degree, and my recent promotion to assistant curator. "It doesn't pay much," I admitted, "but I love discovering new artists, helping them find an audience." "Money isn't everything," he said, though his surroundings, the luxury car, the designer suit, the security detail, suggested he had plenty of it. Passion, as I said earlier, is rare. To find work that ignites it is rarer still. "And your work?" I asked, trying once again to penetrate the vague description he'd given on the plane. "Does it ignite your passion?" Something darkened in his expression. "It serves its purpose." "Which is?" His smile was tight. "Security, stability, control." Before I could probe further, the car slowed, turning onto my street. I felt a strange pang of disappointment that our time was ending, followed immediately by confusion at my own reaction. This man was a stranger, one who set off warning bells despite his surface charm. The car stopped in front of my building. A converted brownstone split into several apartments. It looked shabby in the glow of the streetlights, the small front garden overgrown, the paint on the door chipped. "This is me," I said unnecessarily. Marco was already out of the car, opening my door and scanning the quiet street with those ever-watchful eyes. Luca slid across the seat, following me out rather than remaining in the car as I'd expected. "I'll walk you to your door," he said, his tone making it clear this wasn't a request. Too tired to argue, I led the way up the short path to the front entrance, fishing my keys from my bag. Luca stayed a half step behind me, his presence like a shadow I could feel rather than see. Marco remained by the car, his stance alert despite the deserted street. At the door, I turned to face Luca, unsure of the proper protocol for saying goodbye to a strange man who had insisted on taking the wrong seat, bought me wine, let me sleep on his shoulder, and then driven me home in his private car with security detail. "Thank you for the ride," I said, clutching my keys, "and for letting me keep the seat on the plane." He studied me for a long moment, his dark eyes reflecting the glow of the nearby streetlight. "It was my pleasure, Emma Carter." The way he said my name still sent an involuntary shiver down my spine. There was an intensity to his focus that made me feel like the only person in the world when it was directed at me. "Well, good night then," I said, turning to unlock the door. "Emma." His voice stopped me. "I'd like to see you again." I looked back at him, surprised by the directness of the statement. "Why?" The question seemed to amuse him. "Because you interest me. You see beauty in discarded things. You talk in your sleep. You know Caravaggio well enough to lecture on his use of chiaroscuro, and you took the wrong seat in first class without realizing it belonged to me." "That hardly seems like enough to warrant another meeting," I said, trying to ignore the flutter in my stomach at his words. "Perhaps not," he conceded. "But I rarely find myself intrigued, and when I do, I prefer to explore the feeling." He reached into his jacket and produced a business card, offering it to me. "My number, if you decide you'd like to continue our conversation." The card was heavy, expensive stock, with just his name and a phone number embossed in simple black type. No company name, no title, no email address. "And if I don't call?" I asked, taking the card despite my misgivings. "Then that's your choice," as I said. His lips curved. "But I think you will." His confidence should have annoyed me. Instead, it created a warmth low in my belly that I refused to examine too closely. "Good night, Mr. Moretti," I said, deliberately formal. "Luca," he corrected. "Good night, Emma. Sleep well." He waited as I unlocked the door and stepped inside, his dark eyes watching until I closed it between us. I leaned against the door, heart pounding inexplicably, the weight of his business card heavy in my hand. Upstairs in my small apartment, Vincent greeted me with indignant meows, weaving between my legs as I dropped my bag and collapsed onto my sofa. The elderly neighbor who had been feeding him in my absence had left a note on the coffee table, reporting that he had been a perfect gentleman except for knocking over a plant. I rubbed Vincent's ears absently, my mind still full of dark eyes and that cedar spice scent. The business card sat on my coffee table, the embossed letters catching the light as Vincent batted at it curiously. "Stop that," I told him, rescuing the card. I should throw it away. Nothing good could come from continuing any association with a man like Luca Moretti, a man with security guards and private airport access, a man whose business was so vague it might as well have been invisible. Instead, I placed the card in my wallet, telling myself it was just to keep Vincent from destroying it, not because I intended to use it. I slept fitfully that night, dreaming of dark eyes watching me from shadows, of gentle hands covering mine during turbulence, of a voice that caressed my name like it was something precious. I woke before my alarm, disoriented and unsettled, the memories of the strange flight and stranger ride home, mixing with the fragments of my dreams, until I wasn't sure what had actually happened and what I had imagined. The morning light streaming through my bedroom window grounded me back in reality. I had a cat to feed, plants to water, and a job to return to after a week away. Whatever brief intersection my life had had with Luca Moretti's was over. A strange interlude that would soon fade into anecdote, the time I accidentally took a Mafia boss's seat in first class. Because that's what he was, wasn't he? The security, the deference from the flight crew, the vague business interests, the signet ring. It all pointed to something illicit, something dangerous. The realization should have frightened me more than it did. I dressed carefully for work, selecting a sleek black dress that made me feel confident and capable, applying makeup with more care than usual. It had nothing to do with the possibility of running into a certain dark-eyed man, I told myself. Boston was a big city, the chances of accidentally crossing paths were minimal, and I certainly wasn't going to call him. The gallery was a converted warehouse space in Cambridge, all exposed brick and polished concrete floors, with track lighting that could be adjusted to highlight different works. Walking in felt like coming home after my week away. The familiar smell of paint and paper and the subtle scent of the lavender oil my boss used to clean the surfaces greeted me as I pushed open the heavy glass door. There she is. Our wandering curator returns. David, the gallery owner and my boss, emerged from his office with arms spread wide. He was a slight man in his 60s with wild gray hair and round glasses that gave him the look of a mad scientist rather than an art dealer. "Tell me you convinced Alicia Chen to let us show her installation." "I did," I confirmed, unable to keep the pride from my voice. "She's shipping the main pieces next week. I have the preliminary sketches to show you." "Magnificent." David clapped his hands together. "This calls for coffee. The good kind, not the sludge from the break room." As he bustled about, I settled at my desk in the corner of the main gallery space, organizing my notes from the San Francisco trip. The morning passed in a blur of emails, phone calls, and excited planning for the upcoming exhibition. It wasn't until lunchtime, when David insisted I take a break and get some real food, not that sad sandwich you packed, that I found myself walking to a nearby cafe, my mind drifting back to the events of the previous night. The business card seemed to burn in my wallet, a temptation I was determined to resist. The cafe was crowded with the lunch rush, students from the nearby university mixed with professionals from the surrounding offices. I waited in line, scanning the menu board and trying to ignore the strange sensation that had settled between my shoulder blades. The feeling of being watched. I turned slowly, my eyes sweeping across the cafe. Nothing seemed out of place, just the usual lunch crowd, everyone absorbed in their own conversations or phones, and yet, the sensation persisted, that prickling awareness that someone's gaze was fixed on me. As I reached the front of the line, I ordered a salad and iced tea, still glancing around uneasily. The barista handed me a number for my table, and I found a small empty spot near the window, sliding into the chair with my back to the wall, a position that gave me a view of the entire space. My phone buzzed in my purse. I pulled it out, expecting a text from David about work, but the number was unfamiliar. With a frown, I opened the message. The salmon salad is better than the chicken. And their iced tea is too sweet. Ask for it unsweetened. My heart stuttered in my chest. I looked up sharply, scanning the cafe again, more carefully this time. How did he know where I was? How did he have my number? As if in answer to my unspoken questions, another text appeared. I'm not watching you, if that's what you're wondering. Marco mentioned seeing you enter the cafe. Your number was on the gallery website. The explanation should have calmed me. Instead, it raised more questions. Why was Marco near my workplace? Why would Luca Moretti, a man who clearly had better things to do, take the time to look up my work information and text me about lunch recommendations? My salad arrived. Chicken, not salmon. And I stared at it. Appetite suddenly diminished. After a moment's hesitation, I typed a response. Is Marco following me? The reply came immediately, not at my instruction. He was securing a location for a business meeting nearby. Coincidence. I wasn't sure I believed in coincidences, especially not when they involved men who traveled with security details. Before I could decide how to respond, another text arrived. Have dinner with me tonight. It wasn't a question. The presumption should have annoyed me, and part of me wanted to refuse on principle. But another part, a part I wasn't proud of, thrilled at the invitation, at the idea of seeing those dark eyes again. I have plans tonight, I lied, giving myself time to think. Tomorrow then. Again, not a question. I took a bite of my salad, chewing slowly as I considered my response. The chicken was indeed a bit dry, and the tea too sweet. I pushed both aside. Why? I finally replied, echoing my question from the night before. The response took longer this time, as if he was carefully considering his words, because I find myself thinking about you, and I prefer to address distractions directly. The bluntness of his admission was startling. I was a distraction to be addressed. It wasn't romantic or flattering, yet there was something refreshingly honest about it. And wasn't I distracted too? Hadn't his face, his voice, haunted my dreams? Fine. Tomorrow. I wrote back before I could change my mind. But I choose the place. Cafe Nero on Newbury Street. 7 p.m. I selected a public location, a busy cafe where we would be surrounded by people, safer than whatever exclusive restaurant he might have suggested. I'll see you there, Emma Carter. Even in text, the way he used my full name sent a shiver through me. I finished my lunch quickly, unsettled by the exchange, and eager to return to the gallery where the familiar surroundings might ground me. As I walked back, I scanned the street, wondering if Marco was nearby, if those watchful eyes might be tracking my movements even now. The afternoon dragged, my mind unable to focus fully on work. David noticed my distraction, but attributed it to jet lag, suggesting I leave early to rest. I declined, needing the routine and normalcy to counter the strangeness that had entered my life. By the time I left the gallery, dusk was settling over Cambridge. The streetlights flickering on one by one, the walk to my apartment was short. Just 10 minutes along familiar streets, lined with trees beginning to shed their autumn leaves. Usually I enjoyed this walk, using it to decompress and transition from work to home. Tonight, I found myself glancing over my shoulder, hyper-aware of every shadow, every passing car with tinted windows. Vincent greeted me at the door with his usual mix of indignation and affection, winding between my ankles as I moved through my small apartment, checking that everything was as I'd left it. Nothing was out of place. Yet I couldn't shake the feeling that something fundamental had shifted in my world. I fed Vincent, then stood staring into my nearly empty refrigerator, the prospect of cooking too exhausting to contemplate. Instead, I ordered delivery, then ran a bath, hoping the hot water might wash away the day's tension. As I soaked in the lavender-scented water, I tried to make sense of my own actions. Why had I agreed to meet Luca again? The sensible part of my brain screamed that he was dangerous, that nothing good could come from associating with a man who was almost certainly involved in criminal activities. Yet another part, a part driven by curiosity, by the undeniable attraction I felt, couldn't resist the pull of him. One dinner, I told myself, one conversation in a public place. Then I would satisfy my curiosity and move on with my normal life. The next day at the gallery passed in a blur of preparations for Alicia Chen's exhibition. Crates needed to be scheduled for delivery, wall space measured and marked, lighting planned. The work kept my mind occupied, preventing it from dwelling too much on the evening ahead. As closing time approached, David waved me out the door. "Go home, get some rest. You still look tired." What I looked, though I didn't say it, was nervous. I'd changed outfits 3 times that morning, finally settling on a deep blue wrap dress that was modest enough for work, but nicer than my usual attire. I'd applied makeup with more care than usual, telling myself it was because I had meetings with potential donors, not because I was seeing Luca that evening. At home, I refreshed my makeup and changed into heeled boots that made me feel more confident, more equal to whatever the evening might bring. Vincent watched from the bed, his yellow eyes unblinking. "Don't look at me like that," I told him. "It's just dinner." He flicked his tail in what seemed like judgment. The trip to Newberry Street took longer than expected, the subway crowded with evening commuters. By the time I emerged at the Copley station, I was running a few minutes late. I hurried down the upscale shopping street, past boutiques and galleries now closed for the evening, their displays illuminated in the growing darkness. Café Nero was busy, as I'd hoped it would be, filled with the after-work crowd sipping wine and sharing appetizers. I scanned the space, half expecting Luca to be late, to make me wait as a power play. Instead, I spotted him immediately. He sat at a corner table, positioned with his back to the wall and a clear view of both the entrance and the entire cafe, the same position I'd chosen in the cafe near my work. Unlike the other patrons in casual after-work attire, he wore another impeccable suit, this one a deep charcoal that made his olive skin glow in contrast. He wasn't looking at his phone or a menu. He was simply watching the door, waiting. When his eyes found me, something shifted in his expression. A slight softening around the mouth, a focus that seemed to exclude everything else in the room. I made my way to his table, weaving through the crowded space. As I approached, he stood, an old-world courtesy that seemed at odds with the casual cafe setting. "Emma," he said, just my first name this time, but still with that same inflection that made it sound like more. "You look lovely." "Thank you," I replied, taking the seat across from him. "Have you been waiting long?" "Not at all." He sat after I did, signaling a server with a subtle gesture of his hand. I took the liberty of ordering a bottle of wine. "Unless you'd prefer something else," I glanced around, noting the absence of Marco or any obvious security. "No bodyguards tonight." A smile touched his lips. "They're nearby. I thought their presence might make you uncomfortable." The fact that they were still there, just hidden, was somehow more unsettling. "You didn't answer my question yesterday," I said, deciding to be direct. "Why is Marco watching my workplace?" Luca's expression remained impassive. "As I said, he was securing a location for a meeting. The fact that it was near your gallery was coincidental. You expect me to believe that?" "I expect you to accept it as the answer I'm willing to give," he replied, his tone mild, but with an underlying firmness that made it clear pushing would be futile. The server arrived with a bottle of red wine, presenting it to Luca with deference that suggested he was a regular, despite having chosen my selected location. Luca nodded his approval without examining the label, and the server poured 2 glasses before retreating. "You come here often?" I asked, surprised. "I have interests throughout Boston. I make it a point to be familiar with many establishments." Again, that vagueness about his business. I took a sip of the wine. It was excellent, rich and complex, with notes of dark fruit and something earthier. "What exactly are your business interests, Luca?" I asked, deciding to be direct. "Imports and exports is very broad." He studied me over the rim of his wineglass. "Various goods, luxury items primarily." That's not really an answer. It's the one I'm giving. His tone remained conversational, but there was steel beneath it. "Now, tell me about your exhibition preparations. The artist from San Francisco. Chen, was it? The deliberate change of subject was obvious, but I allowed it, telling him about Alicia's work with reclaimed materials, her vision of transformation and rebirth through art. To my surprise, Luca listened with genuine interest, asking perceptive questions that revealed a deeper knowledge of art than I'd expected. "You know art," I observed after we'd ordered food, a margarita flatbread to share, at his suggestion. "I appreciate beauty," he replied, his eyes holding mine in a way that made it clear he wasn't just talking about paintings. "And I collect things that interest me." There was something possessive in the way he said it, something that made me think of how he'd insisted I stay in his seat on the plane, how he'd texted me about my lunch choices, how he'd appeared in my life with the sudden force of a storm and seemed disinclined to leave it. "Is that what I am?" I asked, my voice lower than I'd intended. "Something to collect?" His expression darkened, a flash of something dangerous crossing his features before it was masked again. "You're not a thing, Emma. You're a puzzle, one I'm still trying to solve." "I'm really not that complicated," I said, uncomfortable with his scrutiny, "just a regular person living a regular life." "Yet you see beauty where others see trash," he countered. "You speak of art with passion that transforms your entire being. There's nothing regular about that." The flatbread arrived, steam rising from the fresh mozzarella. Luca waited for me to take the first piece, his manners impeccable despite the casual setting. "Why art?" he asked as we ate. "What drew you to it?" The question was personal but innocent enough. I found myself telling him about my childhood visits to museums with my librarian mother, about the first time I saw a Monet up close, and felt like I was falling into it, about the summer internship at a small gallery that had set me on my current path. "My parents wanted me to pursue something more practical," I admitted. "But I couldn't imagine doing anything else." "Parents often confuse practicality with happiness," Luca said, something in his tone suggesting personal experience. "They forget that a gilded cage is still a cage." "Is that what happened to you?" I asked, sensing an opening. "Did your parents push you into your business?" His smile was thin. In a manner of speaking, family expectations can be binding. It was the most personal thing he'd revealed, a glimpse behind the careful facade. I wanted to press further, but the sudden tightness around his eyes warned against it. Instead, I asked, "Do you have siblings?" "A younger sister," he replied after a moment's hesitation. "In Italy." "Do you see her often?" "Not as often as I'd like." A genuine softness entered his expression when he spoke of her. "She's studying literature at the University of Bologna, far from the family business, by her choice and my insistence." The statement confirmed what I'd begun to suspect, that whatever Luca's business interests entailed, they weren't something he wanted his beloved sister involved in. The revelation made him more human, more complex than the dangerous, powerful figure I'd first encountered. "Tell me about your brother," Luca said, deftly turning the conversation away from himself. "You mentioned he's in college?" "Yes, at Yale. He's studying engineering, the practical one in the family." I smiled fondly, thinking of my younger brother with his logical mind and kind heart. "He's brilliant, really. Always has been. You're proud of him." It wasn't a question, but I nodded anyway. "Very. He works so hard." "Family is important," Luca said, his voice taking on a different quality, deeper, more resonant, the only true loyalty in this world. There was something almost religious in the way he said it, like a fundamental truth he lived by. It made me wonder about his family beyond the sister he'd mentioned, about the parents who had shaped him into the man sitting across from me. "What about your parents?" I asked, pushing gently at the boundaries he'd established. "Are they still in Italy?" His expression closed slightly. "My father passed several years ago. My mother lives in our family home outside Naples." "I'm sorry about your father," I said sincerely. Luca inclined his head in acknowledgement, but offered nothing more. Instead, he refilled our wine glasses with the practiced ease of someone accustomed to fine dining. "And your artwork? You must create as well as curate." The change of subject was obvious, but I allowed it, recognizing the line he'd drawn. "I paint, but not seriously. Just for myself." "What do you paint?" "Mostly urban landscapes, the places where nature reclaims abandoned spaces. ivy growing over crumbling brick, trees pushing through concrete. I shrugged, suddenly self-conscious. Nothing gallery-worthy. I'd like to see them sometime, he said, his tone making it clear this wasn't mere politeness. The idea of Luca Moretti in my small apartment, examining my amateur paintings, was both thrilling and terrifying. They're really not that good. Let me judge that for myself, he replied, a command softened only slightly by his smile. Our conversation flowed more easily after that, touching on books we'd read, places we'd traveled. Luca was well-read and well-traveled, with insightful observations about everything from Renaissance architecture to contemporary literature. He spoke of Florence with such intimate knowledge that I could almost see the sunlight on the Arno through his descriptions. "You should visit," he said when I expressed my desire to see Italy someday. "The galleries in Florence would appreciate your perspective." "It's on my someday list," I replied, thinking of my modest savings account that barely covered emergencies, let alone European travel. "When I can afford it." Something flickered in his eyes, not pity, but a sort of calculation. "Perhaps sooner than you think." I didn't know what to make of that comment, and before I could question it, he changed the subject again, asking about my favorite exhibits at the Museum of Fine Arts. The conversation shifted to safer territory, the easy exchange of artistic opinions and experiences. As we finished our wine, I realized with surprise that 2 hours had passed. The cafe had emptied somewhat, the after-work crowd thinning to a few lingering couples and small groups. "I should probably head home," I said reluctantly. "I have an early meeting tomorrow," Luca nodded, signaling for the check with that same subtle gesture. When it arrived, he placed a credit card on the tray without even glancing at the total. "I can pay my share," I offered, reaching for my wallet. "Please don't insult me," he said, his tone light, but his eyes serious. I subsided, uncomfortable with his largesse, but recognizing that the amount was insignificant to him. When the server returned with his card, Luca added a cash tip that made the young man's eyes widen. "My car's outside," Luca said as we stood. "I'll take you home." "That's not necessary," I replied quickly. "I can take the tea." "It's late, Emma." He spoke my name with that same inflection that made it sound like a caress. "Let me see you home safely." The reasonable part of my brain whispered that getting into his car again would be crossing a line, moving from a casual public dinner to something more intimate. But the night had turned cold, and the thought of waiting for the subway, then walking the several blocks to my apartment, was decidedly unappealing. "All right," I conceded. "Thank you." Outside, the black SUV waited at the curb, Marco standing beside it with his ever-watchful eyes. He opened the rear door as we approached, nodding respectfully to Luca, and giving me a slight inclination of his head that might have been acknowledgement. The interior was as I remembered, luxurious leather, subtle lighting, and that cedar spice scent that I now associated inextricably with Luca. As we pulled away from the curb, I noticed a glass partition separating us from Marco and the driver, creating a cocoon of privacy in the back seat. "You enjoyed yourself tonight," Luca said, a statement rather than a question. "I did," I admitted. "You're not what I expected." "What did you expect?" I hesitated, unsure how to articulate my preconceptions without offending him. "Someone less cultured, less interested in art and literature." A smile played at the corners of his mouth. "Because of my business interests?" "Because of your security detail and private airport access," I replied dryly. He laughed then, a genuine sound that transformed his face, softening the sharp angles and making him appear younger, almost carefree. "Fair enough." "But culture and power have always been intertwined, Emma. The Medicis were bankers and politicians before they were patrons of the arts. And criminals," I added, testing the waters. His smile remained, though something shifted in his eyes. By some definitions, by others they were businessmen who understood how the world truly worked. The car turned onto my street, slowing as it approached my building. Unlike the previous night, the street wasn't deserted. A young couple walked hand in hand toward the corner, and lights glowed in several windows of neighboring buildings. Marco exited first when the car stopped, scanning the area before opening Luca's door. I reached for my own door handle, but Luca's hand covered mine, stopping me. "Allow him," he said quietly. "It's his job." Marco rounded the car and opened my door, standing back to give me space but remaining alert, his eyes continuously moving. I stepped out, adjusting to the sudden chill after the warmth of the car. Luca emerged behind me, buttoning his suit jacket with that same elegant flick of his wrist. "I'll walk you to your door." Like the night before, I led the way up the short path, acutely aware of his presence behind me. At my door I turned, keys in hand, suddenly uncertain of the proper protocol for ending the evening. "Thank you for dinner," I said, falling back on basic politeness. "And the ride." Luca studied me in the soft glow of the porch light, his dark eyes intent. "I'd like to see you again, Emma." Despite having anticipated this, my heart still skipped at his words. "I'm busy with exhibition preparations for the next few weeks," I hedged. Not quite a refusal. "The weekend after next," he said, as if I hadn't spoken. "I have a charity event at the MFA. I'd like you to accompany me. The Museum of Fine Arts, my favorite place in Boston, a setting where I'd feel comfortable despite the formal nature of a charity event." It was a thoughtful choice, one that showed he'd paid attention to our conversation. "I don't have anything to wear to something like that," I said, the practical concern overriding my hesitation. "That can be arranged," he replied dismissively. "I can't accept expensive gifts from you," I said firmly. "I hardly know you." Something like approval flickered in his eyes. "Then we have time to remedy that before the event. Dinner again, this weekend?" His persistence should have been annoying. Instead, I found it oddly flattering that this powerful, cultured man seemed so determined to spend time with me. "Saturday?" I suggested. "I have gallery events Friday night." "Saturday," he agreed with a slight nod. "I'll pick you up at 7. It wasn't a question, but I found I didn't mind his assumption. "All right." He moved closer then, slowly enough that I could have stepped back if I wanted to. I remained still, my breath catching as he leaned in. His lips brushed my cheek, the contact brief, but sending electricity racing across my skin. "Good night, Emma Carter," he murmured, his breath warm against my ear. "Good night, Luca," I replied, my voice steadier than I felt. He waited as I unlocked the door and stepped inside, just as he had the night before. This time, I glanced back before closing it, catching a final glimpse of his tall figure illuminated in the porch light, his eyes still fixed on me with that same intense focus. Inside my apartment, I leaned against the door, heart racing inexplicably. Vincent appeared, winding around my ankles with his usual demanding affection, grounding me back in my normal reality. "What am I doing?" I asked him as I scooped him up, burying my face in his soft fur. He purred in response, unconcerned with my existential crisis. The next few days passed in a blur of gallery work, the preparations for Alicia Chen's exhibition consuming most of my waking hours. The first shipment of her pieces arrived, and I lost myself in the meticulous process of unpacking, cataloging, and arranging them in the space. David watched with approval as the exhibition took shape, the reclaimed materials transformed into stunning sculptures that seemed to capture movement in static form. "You have a good eye, Emma," he said, as we stepped back to evaluate a particularly complex piece. "This is going to be our most successful show of the year." His praise warmed me, momentarily pushing thoughts of Luca Moretti to the back of my mind. This was my world, these carefully curated spaces where art could transform and transport. It was solid, tangible, unlike the strange new territory I was exploring with Luca. But in quiet moments, on the subway ride home, in the stillness of my apartment at night, Luca would drift back into my thoughts. The brush of his lips against my cheek, the intensity of his gaze, the contradictions of a man who employed security guards but could speak passionately about Caravaggio, who seemed dangerous, but treated me with unfailing courtesy. By Saturday, I was a bundle of nerves, changing outfits 3 times before settling on a simple black dress that was the nicest thing I owned. I told myself it was just another dinner, that I was simply curious about this enigmatic man, that I could walk away at any time. But when the sleek black SUV pulled up outside my building exactly at 7, and Marco opened the door to reveal Luca waiting inside, I knew I was already in deeper than I'd intended. The surge of pleasure I felt at seeing him again couldn't be explained away by mere curiosity. "You look beautiful," he said as I slid into the seat beside him, his eyes moving over me with appreciation that made my skin warm. "Thank you," I replied, taking in his appearance. another perfectly tailored suit, this one a deep blue that brought out the warmth in his olive skin. "Where are we going? I thought you might enjoy something different tonight," he said, a hint of mystery in his tone, a little surprise. "I'm not particularly fond of surprises," I admitted, a flutter of unease in my stomach. Luca's lips curved slightly. "Trust me, Emma." Those 3 simple words hung between us, loaded with meaning beyond this moment, this car ride. Did I trust him? Could I? Should I? The car moved through the Boston streets, heading away from the city center. I watched familiar landmarks disappear, replaced by areas I rarely visited, until finally we turned onto a narrow road leading to the harbor. Lights reflected off the dark water, boats bobbing gently at their moorings. "The harbor?" I asked, curious despite my apprehension. "Patience," Luca replied, that enigmatic smile still playing at his lips. The SUV stopped at a private dock where a sleek yacht waited, illuminated against the night sky. It wasn't the massive, ostentatious vessel I might have expected, but rather an elegant, mid-sized craft with clean lines and subtle luxury. Marco opened my door, and Luca guided me toward the gangplank with a light touch at the small of my back. A crew member stood at attention, nodding respectfully as we approached. "Mr. Moretti, everything is prepared as requested." "Thank you, Anthony," Luca replied, his hand never leaving my back as we boarded. The yacht's interior was stunning: polished wood, cream leather seating, and subtle lighting that created an atmosphere of intimate luxury. Through large windows, the Boston skyline glittered across the harbor, the city transformed into a constellation of lights. "This is unexpected," I said, taking it all in. "You said you like urban landscapes," Luca replied, guiding me toward the bow. "I thought you might appreciate a different perspective of Boston." The thoughtfulness of the gesture caught me off guard. He'd listened not just to my words, but to what lay beneath them, my artist's eye, my appreciation for seeing familiar things from new angles. On the forward deck, a table had been set for dinner, complete with candles protected from the gentle breeze by crystal holders. A bottle of wine was already breathing, 2 glasses waiting. "You've thought of everything," I murmured as he held out a chair for me. "I try to," he said, taking the seat across from me. With a subtle gesture to a waiting crew member, he set the evening in motion. The yacht slipped away from the dock so smoothly I barely felt the movement, gliding into the harbor as a server appeared with the first course, a delicate seafood appetizer that melted on my tongue. Luca poured the wine himself, a rich red that complemented the food perfectly. "Tell me what you see," he said, nodding toward the city skyline as we drifted past. I followed his gaze, taking in the tapestry of lights, the historic buildings nestled among modern skyscrapers, the bridges spanning the dark water. "Layers of history," I replied thoughtfully, each generation building on the last, sometimes preserving, sometimes replacing, light and shadow defining the shapes, just like in a painting. Luca watched me as I spoke, that intense focus making me feel both seen and exposed. "You have an artist's soul, Emma Carter." The dinner progressed through several exquisite courses, each more delicious than the last. We talked easily, about art and travel, about books and films, carefully avoiding the subjects of family and business. The yacht circled the harbor, offering changing views of the city from every angle, the crew appearing and disappearing with perfect timing, never intruding on our conversation. It was the most romantic evening of my life, and the most surreal, dining on a private yacht with a man who was still largely a mystery to me, a man whose business I suspected was criminal, but whose manner was unfailingly courteous, whose taste was impeccable, and whose interest in me was as flattering as it was inexplicable. As dessert was cleared away, a delicate chocolate creation that paired perfectly with the after-dinner port Luca had selected, he rose and offered me his hand. "Walk with me?" I took his hand, allowing him to lead me to the stern of the yacht where a small, more private deck offered a view of the wake stretching behind us, a silvery path on the dark water. The night air had grown cooler, and I shivered slightly in my sleeveless dress. Without comment, Luca removed his suit jacket and draped it over my shoulders. It was warm from his body, enveloping me in his scent, that now familiar cedar and spice that made my pulse quicken. "Cold?" he asked, standing close enough that I could feel the heat radiating from him. "Not anymore," I replied, pulling his jacket tighter around me. "Thank you for tonight. It's been magical. I'm glad you've enjoyed it." His voice was lower, more intimate in the privacy of the stern deck. "I've wanted to show you this side of Boston since you mentioned your paintings." Again, that attentiveness to what I'd shared, that desire to connect with my interests. It was a seduction more effective than any grand gesture could have been. "Luca," I said, gathering my courage, "what is this? Between us?" He turned to face me fully, his dark eyes reflecting the lights from the shoreline. "What do you want it to be, Emma?" "I don't know," I admitted. "You're not someone I would normally—" I broke off, unsure how to continue without offending him. "Someone you would normally, date? Trust? Desire?" His voice remained gentle, but there was an edge to it now. "Because of my business? Because of what I suspect about your business," I clarified. "You've never actually told me what you do." He was silent for a long moment, his eyes never leaving mine. When he spoke, his voice was measured, careful. "My family has interests in real estate, shipping, and private equity. We've operated for 3 generations, building connections and influence. Some of our methods, especially in the beginning, were outside conventional legal frameworks." It was the most direct he'd been about his work, and though the words were carefully chosen, the implication was clear. "You're saying your family is in the Mafia," I stated plainly, needing to hear it spoken aloud. "That's an oversimplification," he replied, neither confirming nor denying. "The world isn't divided into neat categories of legal and illegal, Emma. There are gray areas, spaces between what's written in law books and how business actually functions, and you operate in those gray areas." "Sometimes," he acknowledged. "But my interests are primarily legitimate now. The family business is evolving, as all things must." I absorbed this, turning to look out at the water, gathering my thoughts. "Why me, Luca? You could have anyone. Someone from your world. Someone who understands those gray areas better than I ever could." His hand came to rest lightly on the small of my back, his presence solid and warm beside me. "Because you see beauty in discarded things. Because you understand transformation. Because when you talk about art, you come alive in a way that most people never do about anything." He turned me gently to face him, his hands settling at my waist. "And because from the moment you took my seat and looked up at me with those defiant, exhausted eyes, I haven't been able to think about anything else." The raw honesty in his voice made my breath catch. Before I could respond, he continued, his grip tightening slightly. "I should warn you, Emma. I'm not a man who gives up easily once I've decided I want something, or someone." There was possession in his tone, a hint of the danger I'd sensed from the beginning. I should have been frightened, should have pulled away and ended this strange connection before it went any further. Instead, I found myself leaning closer, drawn to the intensity of his focus, to the heat of his body so near mine. "And what if I don't want to be wanted?" I challenged, my voice barely above a whisper. His smile was slow, knowing. "Then say the word, and I'll have Marco take you home. You won't see me again." The choice was mine, clearly, explicitly mine. I could walk away now, return to my normal life of gallery openings and modest ambitions. Or I could step into Luca's world, with all its luxury and danger, its shadows and complexities. "And if I do want to be wanted?" I asked, my heart racing. In answer, Luca's hand came up to cup my face, his thumb tracing the line of my cheekbone with surprising gentleness. "Then know that I want all of you, Emma. Not just for tonight. Not just for the charity event. I want to know every layer, every shadow and light. I don't share what's mine, and I protect what I care about. With everything I have." The possessiveness of his words should have alarmed me. Instead, they sent heat spiraling through my body. There was something intoxicating about being wanted so completely by a man like Luca Moretti. A man who could have anything, or anyone, he desired. "I'm not yours," I said, needing to establish that boundary even as I leaned into his touch. "Not yet," he agreed, his eyes darkening. "But I'm a patient man, Emma Carter. And I think we both know where this is leading." When his lips finally met mine, it was with a restraint that surprised me, a gentleness that belied the intensity in his eyes. His hand slid from my face to the back of my neck, cradling my head as the kiss deepened, becoming something hungry and demanding. I responded with an eagerness that shocked me, my hands gripping the front of his shirt, pulling him closer. All the tension that had been building between us since that first moment on the plane seemed to ignite, transforming into a heat that left me breathless. When we finally broke apart, Luca's breathing was as uneven as mine. His composure fractured for the first time since I'd met him. His eyes had gone almost black, his hands still holding me close against him. "Tell me to stop," he said, his voice rough with desire, "if that's what you want." But it wasn't what I wanted. Despite all the warning bells, despite the rational part of my brain listing all the reasons this was a terrible idea, I wanted Luca Moretti with an intensity that frightened me. "Don't stop," I whispered, and watched something primal flash in his eyes before his mouth claimed mine again. 6 months later, I stood in the gallery surrounded by Alicia Chen's transformed objects, watching as Boston's art community circulated through the space, champagne glasses in hand. The exhibition had been a triumph, selling out almost completely on opening night, bringing attention to both Alicia's work and our small gallery. "There you are." A familiar voice in my ear made me smile before I even turned. Luca stood behind me, impeccable as always in a tailored suit, his dark eyes warm as they met mine. "The curator of the hour." "Hardly," I demurred, though pride swelled in my chest at the exhibition's success. "It's Alicia's night, and you made it possible." He handed me a glass of champagne, his fingers brushing mine in that deliberate way he had of maintaining contact. "David tells me 3 major galleries have approached him about collaboration since this show opened." I sipped the champagne, savoring the moment. He's worked so hard for this recognition. "As have you." Luca's hand settled at the small of my back, a possessive gesture I'd grown accustomed to over the months we'd been together. "Are you ready to go? The reservation is for 9. We were celebrating not just the exhibition's success, but my recent promotion to full curator, with an increased salary that, while still modest by Luca's standards, represented a significant step in my career. He'd insisted on dinner at Boston's most exclusive restaurant, brushing aside my protests about the expense. As we made our way through the gallery, saying our goodbyes, I caught David watching us with a mixture of curiosity and concern. He'd never quite approved of my relationship with Luca, sensing something dangerous beneath the polished exterior that most people saw. But he'd grown to respect Luca's genuine appreciation for art and his unfailing support of my career. Outside, the familiar black SUV waited at the curb. Marco, now a fixture in my life, opened the door with a slight nod that passed for warmth from him. I'd learned that his watchfulness was not just professional duty, but genuine loyalty to Luca, earned through years of shared history I was only beginning to understand. As the car pulled away from the gallery, Luca took my hand, his thumb tracing the delicate gold bracelet he'd given me on our 3-month anniversary. Simple, but elegant, like all his gifts, chosen with careful attention to my taste, rather than as displays of his wealth. "I'm proud of you," he said, his voice low and sincere. "David is lucky to have you." "I'm the lucky one," I replied, thinking of how my life had transformed since that fateful flight when I'd taken the wrong seat. The gallery took a chance on me when I had nothing but an art history degree and enthusiasm. Luca's smile was indulgent. "You've always had much more than that, Emma. Vision, passion, determination. I recognized it from the beginning." I leaned against him, comfortable now in the luxury of his world while still maintaining my own. It hadn't been an easy balance to find. His possessiveness sometimes chafed against my independence, and the shadowy aspects of his business remained a subject we approached cautiously. But we had found our way to a relationship built on mutual respect as well as desire. Luca never interfered with my work, never tried to help my career through his connections. And I never asked about certain meetings, certain phone calls that he took in private, certain business associates who looked more like Marco than like art collectors. The car stopped at the restaurant, where we were immediately shown to a private room with views of the Boston Common. A bottle of champagne was already waiting in an ice bucket, and as the maitre d' poured 2 glasses, I noticed a small velvet box beside my place setting. My heart stuttered in my chest as I looked from the box to Luca, who was watching me with an intensity that hadn't dimmed since our first meeting. "Luca," I began. But he shook his head slightly, silencing me. "Open it first," he said, his voice steady but with an undercurrent of something I rarely heard from him, uncertainty. With slightly trembling fingers, I picked up the box and opened it. Inside was not the engagement ring I had half expected, but a key. A simple, ordinary key on a delicate silver chain. "What is this?" I asked, confused. Luca's expression softened as he took the key from the box, holding it up between us. "This is the key to a studio space in the North End. Top floor, northern exposure, excellent natural light. It's yours, to paint in, to create in, no strings attached." I stared at him, speechless. He knew I'd been struggling to find time and space for my own art, squeezed into the corner of my small apartment when I could manage it. A dedicated studio was a dream I'd mentioned once, offhandedly, months ago. "I can't accept this," I said automatically, though my fingers itched to take the key to claim the space he was offering. "You can," he countered. "Consider it an investment in your artistic future. The space is leased for 2 years, paid in full. What you create there is entirely yours, whether you sell it, show it, or keep it private." The careful way he phrased it, emphasizing my autonomy, my ownership of whatever I created, revealed how well he'd come to know me, to understand my fierce independence alongside my creative ambitions. "Thank you," I whispered, overcome by the thoughtfulness of the gift. He placed the key and chain in my palm, closing my fingers over it. "I want to see what you'll create when you have the space to truly work. Your urban landscapes, your transformations. I want to see the world through your eyes, Emma." As I looked into Luca Moretti's dark eyes, I realized how far we'd come from that first night on the plane. He was still dangerous, still powerful, still operating in those gray areas he'd spoken of. But he was also the man who listened when I talked about art, who respected my work, who understood my need for both security and freedom. And I was still the woman who had taken the wrong seat in first class. But I was also someone who had found her voice, her confidence, and her path, both professionally and personally. "I love you," I said, the words still new enough between us to carry weight. His smile was slow and genuine, warming his eyes in a way few people ever saw. "And I love you, Emma Carter, never doubt that." As he leaned across the table to kiss me, I knew our story was just beginning. There would be challenges ahead. His world and mine still existed in different orbits, intersecting but distinct. There would be compromises, arguments, moments of doubt. But as Luca's lips met mine, I was certain of one thing: taking the wrong seat that night had led me exactly where I was meant to be.